Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another filmmaker conversation session here at this year's Folk Film Gathering. My name is Johnny Murray. I work at Edinburgh College of Art and I'll be your host for tonight, but hopefully that's going to involve me speaking as infrequently and shortly and briefly as possible because we've got some great guests again this evening. And just before we kick off, I'd like to welcome from Amber Film and Photography Collective, Ellen Hare and Peter Roberts, and from Belfast Film Workshop, Alistair Heron. And we're here to talk about two films which are featuring in our programme this year. Front Room and Belfast Film Workshop's 1983 collaboration, Acceptable Levels, and then much more recently a work from Amber which is called What Happened Here. And just to say that both those films are available to stream in our programme, so if you haven't had a chance to watch them yet, please do after the conversation this evening. Tonight's session is being recorded, so if you're arriving slightly late or you need to dip in and out at any point over the next hour and a half or so, please feel free to do so, and do so in confident knowledge that the session will be there to pick up bits that you perhaps miss. We are live captioning tonight's session as well, and thanks to our captioners for that. And also to say that while I'll be asking questions, and hopefully our guests tonight may be asking questions and making observations about each other's work, if anyone in the audience has questions, please do post them in the chat bar, and we'll try to make sure to get to those and pose them of our guests this evening before we wrap up. So I'm going to begin, and maybe just to start, Ellen, Peter and Alistair, with a sort of broad contextual question. I think there's many reasons why it's really great and thought-provoking to have these two films together in dialogue with each other. But one way in which I think they dialogue really interestingly that I'd like to begin with just has to do with the dates of production. So with Acceptable Levels, we have a film made in the early 1980s, and one of the first works, I think I'm correct in saying, that would have reached an audience through the Workshop Declaration and Channel 4 and the BFI's involvement in workshop-based film production in Ireland and the UK. And then we get a much more recent work. So we're looking here at a 40-year span of British and Irish film and television history. And I just wondered that, given that you've all been intimately involved in that process over the last 4 decades, if you could begin with some reflections on what the impact of that history has been on Irish and British film culture, and how the landscape for workshop-based production has changed since the early 1980s.
Well, I mean, one of the sad things is that I think Amber is one of the few remaining workshops that have survived actually from in that 40-year period, and still operates on the same basis as it did 40 years ago. But I think it's interesting that although there's that huge gap between the two films, actually what happened here is almost like a diary of that 40 years, because a lot of the material in What Happened Here was created obviously in the 80s and was facilitated by the Workshop Declaration. So the fact that we were able to work in the Easington community in that way was because we were a workshop and we were funded by Channel 4 to basically have the freedom to do whatever we wanted. And we were able to sustain that relationship because of that. And I think that's a lot of the motivation for making the film was, in a way, to tell that story of, even though it's not explicitly telling that story about Amber, it is in a way about our relationship to the people of Easington and their story and their history. And it's for me, it's really interesting also because actually Acceptable Levels was the first workshop film that I worked on, because at the time I was a member of Front Room. So it really does bookend the whole thing, because that was the first film that I worked on, and What Happened Here is the last film that I worked on. So they're very intimately connected for me, because I think the experience of working in Belfast really impacted on me personally, and then I carried that over into working at Amber and the sort of experiment with fiction, you know, creating fictions in communities with using the people in the communities as the subject and the origin of the storylines and all of that. So I think they are, but for me, they're very connected. But obviously the landscape has changed hugely in that time.
I think it's just important really to remember that there were a number of films made in that particular area in Easington. I mean, we did make three feature films there, but also there's been photographic projects been going on over the years, and current events. We had a current events unit that was working on issues around the miners' strike at the time, in relation to kind of food parcels and things like that. So there's been a whole level and a whole range of activities going on over the years. It's never really ceased in that area. I mean, other areas we've been in lasted, 8 or 9 years, and then really not had much engagement with Ellie living there now. Well, for the past number of years, for the past, how long? 10, 20 years, isn't it? It's been
20 years, yeah.
In Easington. That engagement has been kind of sustained.
Yeah, I think that what the workshop declaration did, it opened up opportunities for communities to directly engage with media that was normally would have been quite exclusive. I think the sort of distribution exhibition landscape has radically changed today, whereas in 1983 it was incredibly difficult. And I think I don't know if it's been properly acknowledged, a number of individuals like Murray Martin, and, who really negotiated for that opportunity to unfold. There was quite a lot of reaction, and there were a number of people, I think, who, proffered that and, developed it. And Amber's a classic example of, the consistency of that access and creativity.
And just maybe following on from that, and I think you all already touched upon it in those initial answers. Maybe one of the many things that was important about the workshop declaration was that it allowed communities and filmmakers to undertake certain forms of exploring local place and culture, which would have been difficult or impossible previously. And looking at these two films together, and if you want to talk about other films you've been involved in as well, I mean, please do. But I wanted to ask, how important is exploration of place and locality and local culture in your respective bodies of work? And also just thinking about the two films that we have in this year's programme, do you feel that exploring place and locality needs to extend to consideration of how a particular place or culture that you're exploring has been previously represented or is being contemporaneously represented by other practitioners and forces as well? Because that comes through very strongly for me, at least in the two films that we're particularly thinking about tonight. These are not representations that exist in a vacuum, and they don't feel to me like representations that misunderstand themselves as existing in a vacuum. They're entering into dialogue with other forms of representation, and quite often much more politically problematic and unsympathetic forms of representation.
I think it's absolutely key. You're right. It's absolutely, that question is absolutely key, to both films, really. I mean, I think if you look at like the statement that's made by I think it's Betty Heathfield, who was one of the women that was speaking at the miners' weekend school, and she says in that passage about media representation, there's a passage, isn't there, like looking at how the miners' strike was portrayed in the media, and she says, we don't care about balance anymore. You know, we only care about getting our point of view across, because it hasn't been put across. And if you think of the woman in Acceptable Levels, you know, when she waves the plastic bullet at the camera and says, you know, this is what is happening and this is what you're not showing on the screens. And I mean, it's absolutely the same question, and it's something that certainly I think, I mean, for me, that has been the motivating question for the whole of my life in filmmaking, really. I mean, like, how do you get across the actual point of view of the people who are experiencing it, you know, in that locality, in that situation, and the whole notion of, you know, balance that broadcasting kind of, you know, claims to kind of live by, actually never did represent those communities, and you know, the only way to do that is actually to immerse yourself in the single point of view of the community itself, and try to understand and to portray that as authentically as you can, you know.
And is there a process of discovery and negotiation that happens for you all as filmmakers when you're working in this way? So I think it's the English director in Acceptable Levels who at one point says something like, "Oh, don't worry, I already wrote the voiceover 3 weeks ago. You know, I know what it is that I'm going to say about these people before I've even met and interacted with them." And I just wonder, I get the sense that in these films and some of the other films that you've made as well, that idea of going with a preconceived notion that you then simply have to functionally record is the absolute opposite of what you want to do. That it's precisely not about having assumptions about people and places and communities that you impose upon them.
Yeah.
Alistair, you should answer that one.
No, I was going to say, I mean, when I'm not a filmmaker at the moment, so after we did Acceptable Levels, we did go into making quite a lot of documentaries for not so much Channel 4, but RTE and BBC locally. And we still kept up that engagement. We did ones on photography and music, a variety of things. Within that structure, moving away, I suppose, more from that feature narrative. But I think what happened with Acceptable Levels, and it grew out of, I think, Ellie's and John Davis's possible engagement with another film called Maeve. But what Ellie in particular did was she came and lived in the community for a long time. And so did John. I mean, and you know, they lived there and observed the process of writing that script and of being in the communities and going around the communities for a long, long time, which is not so the time restraints were not there. That was a different process of creative engagement. And I think what Ellie said is very, very important, that to give voice to a community, to allow that vernacular to unfold in a way that demands a sensitivity and a different approach to what is the normal media, as you've said, Johnny, like in the film when the director has already done the voiceover, in that sense that there's a particular process and a particular mechanism that I think the workshop, and I would say Amber in particular, specifically, challenges by a more considered and a more considered approach, you know, that has that sympathy that doesn't seem to be there. I mean, I think what happens at the moment is a kind of a reverse. It's almost like there's a plethora of so much information available that the distribution exhibition really kind of how to meet that with local voice and how local voice can be facilitated and enabled to be heard, to be sounded. How that's to be done. I don't think, you know, the orthodoxy of the media, the traditional medias that are present now, UK, Ireland, what have you, are really have changed the certain things have changed, but they haven't really taken on board the lessons and the kind of the good lessons that the workshop declaration was attempting. What do you think, Pete, on it? I mean, what's your?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I think the interesting thing about the workshop movement and the whole kind of relationship with broadcasters was that there was no guarantee that the stuff was going to be shown anywhere. There was a certain kind of freedom that was allowed. And it's unlike the kind of portrayal of the media process in Acceptable Levels, where, you know, where people are you know, bringing their own agenda, and they know what the acceptable story is going to be before starting out, really, and they can tailor that story to suit the expectations of the broadcaster. But of course, there was no guarantee that our stuff was going to be broadcast. There was a guarantee that they would allow us to make the stuff. But it's interesting with the discussion about Channel 4 at the moment and the kind of proposed privatization. The arguments against it have been economically, it's not kind of feasible because still Channel 4 doesn't own its material, which surprised me to hear that. I thought, you know, after the kind of semi-privatization of it, you know, during the Thatcher period, that all that kind of support from the other ITV stations and had kind of been eroded, and the advertisers money didn't have to be made from advertising for it to kind of continue its work. But that was very much the case when we started out, and when during the kind of strong period of the workshop movement. It was there were no expectations, really, which I thought was a really that was the kind of freedom to be able to really kind of engage with communities and get the story that those people wanted to tell.
I mean, it's amazing, really, that Acceptable Levels, I think, were
Yeah.
actually. I mean, you know, there's no way that film would have been shown on the BBC at that time, you know, obviously. I mean, it's very critical of the BBC. But I mean, nobody was looking over our shoulders at all, you know, during the making of it. And like Pete says, they could have not shown it, but they chose to show it, which was brave, I think. And, you know, I think the fact that it was fiction as well made it easier, because if it had been documentary, you probably wouldn't have got away with saying the things that we were saying, but because it was fictional, we were able to put those, you know, put those words into the mouths of fictional characters. And that was why we could kind of get away with it in a way.
I'm just thinking here about some of the things that Pete says about a moment in Irish and UK film cultures where the Workshop Declaration opens up this space for particular kinds of filmmaking that aren't defined by particular fixed expectations. Can I ask you about your own respective senses of dealing with expectation? So I take Pete's point that, you know, the broadcaster still needed ultimately to decide to broadcast finished works, but I'm really interested in your respective experiences and perspectives as filmmakers. How would you know whether with these two films or indeed other films that you've made, that you've reached a point where you would be happy for something to be seen because it's an authentic, it's a respectful, it's a supportive portrayal. I'm thinking here of something. I think it's that the character Kathleen says in Acceptable Levels, where she talks about the place where she lives has a heart. But I think she says to Sue, the English researcher, but you have to live here in order to find it. I mean, thinking about these projects, or as I say, others that you've been involved in have made, how as filmmakers do you know, do you achieve that confidence that you have found the heart of the place and the community that you're representing as part of a particular project?
I think one of the ways is the fact that people keep coming back to us. That we've been working often with people we've known and engaged with over the period of 30 odd years, and obviously what we're doing, even though people may have a gripe about one or two things that we've in the way we've represented them, on the whole, they believe that what we're doing is attempting an honest representation of their experience. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother with us. Why would they? Why would they put up with all that kind of hassle of filmmaking?
And I mean, we at Amber, certainly, like, we always show, versions of the film as it's going along. We show it, we have rough cut showings to the community before we release anything. So we get a sense of if we're on the right track, I think, from that. And sometimes we have changed things as a result of that dialogue. I mean, sometimes even at the script making stage, and people have said, that's not right, or that isn't the way we feel about it. And I think we are up for being responsive to that. But I mean, you never really know, except, like as Pete says, people come back. If people come back and people from, we were recently asked to make a film in Easington, not this one, but the one before this. Some people from the community came and said, will you come and make a film about this? And I mean, I guess that shows that they do feel like that we are representing them fairly and authentically.
I mean, without wanting to lift the lid further than any of you would be happy for us to do in this conversation, are there any specific examples, illustrative examples from the two films that we're focusing discussion on tonight that you remember, where certain things about the projects or the final forms of the projects did change because members of the community are giving you script notes or are giving you notes on rough cuts and in progress?
I was going to say, I think that it's been a long time. I mean, we did a series for BBC. There used to be a thing called Article 10, which refers to the Declaration of Human Rights, that everybody has ostensibly access to the means of expression, if you want. I mean, I'm putting it in a very simplified form. It depends what you mean in the sense of a community. It seems to me a community is vibrant, it's open. A community that's closed, and one of the first things you'll get, generally, I think, and into many communities, is who are you, where are you from, in that sense. And maybe more open communities can embrace and allow that important word that Ali said, dialogue, to unfold. So that in going into that community, for example, when Ali was living with us, and we were kind of incomers to the community that we were actually living in Belfast, a place called the Markets at that time. But I think that it's the fluidity of a community and how it can culturally create a dynamic. And it's really it's very, very delicate, the notion of incomers, or the sort of derogatory West of Ireland term blow-ins. and how that is managed, and how the creativity may unfold, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes a community can be quite closed, and that's a challenge. That's a challenge for a community of interest to explore. So I think it's a very interesting question that you asked, Johnny, about, you know, that sense of how to facilitate and enable, and, you know, not get it right, but from not getting it right to be able to see that as a learning, and to move creatively in whatever sort of medium you might be working in, to open up that conversation, not close it down. So especially where communities can be closed and isolated and separative, and I think that's all sorts of communities. It isn't just necessarily communities of a specific place. It can be a class community. It can be all kinds of religious, all sorts of different communities. So it's interesting. It's an interesting area of, especially where filmmaking is collaborative as well, and especially if you're trying to do it the way Amber are doing it, which is very collaborative and open, or attempting that kind of discourse to happen. It's you know, it's admirable. Well, it's more, I don't mean that in a patronizing sense, but I do think it's kind of, it's challenging, shall we say.
But I think, I mean, the interesting thing about Acceptable Levels was that, I mean, unlike, in a way, Amber, because that was the coming together of a group of filmmakers from London with a group of filmmakers actually from Belfast. So in that sense, it, you know, it like that openness had to be there, didn't it, between you and us, in the first place. I mean, that was the exciting thing about the collaboration, because we came with this experience. I mean, the whole way that film, the initial spark for that film was when I came to stay with you when I was working on a BBC documentary on the crew. And I used to come back at night and tell Alistair and Kate these stories of what happened during the day, you know, and being really horrified. And all that stuff that's in the film a lot of it comes from that experience, you know, that the whole notion of them having this idea before they even started of what they were going to say. And I mean, a lot of the incidents that are in the film actually happened to me, you know, either on crews or I worked in cutting rooms as well in the BBC. And so I was the spy in the camp in a way, you know. But what was I going to say?
So would you say your sense of community, Ellie, expand? Your sense of community, there is a certain community, say, working in the BBC, but there's also a certain community with us and with the environment that you were living in.
Yeah, and the conflict between, I mean, that experience of being, living with you in the market. Yeah. And having this kind of completely split sort of view of the world, you know, like being on the crew during the day and then coming back to that situation and hearing, you know, what your experiences have been were. But I was good. I also I had thought of one example actually, because you were asking for an example. I can remember one example which was actually a conflict within the filmmaking team, which was, I don't know if you remember in the film, towards the end, right, very near the end, the last scene that I've forgotten the name of the researcher in the film.
Sue, I think.
Yeah, Sue. So her final scene when you know she's been kind of fighting this rearguard action to try and get the material shown, the true material of what actually happened, and of course it's eventually just hits the cutting room floor, and she objects, and then the guy says, well, you can always take your name off it, you know. And then there's the final scene with her, with the chief exec or whatever he is, complimenting her on her new position and her new project that she's working on, and she doesn't say anything, you know, about what happened. And we had I remember having a huge discussion with Alistair and John on the day, because I think that the actress who played that part was really unhappy with that scene because she felt it wasn't in character, you know, because she got so involved in, I mean, because they were all living there as well, you know, all the actors were also living in Belfast with us during the making of it, and she'd got so involved in the sort of outrage that this character had experienced, that she just felt she couldn't do that scene. You know, she couldn't just walk away and say thank you to this guy who'd just given her a new job because she kept quiet. You know, and Alistair insisted that no, we have to have that scene. It's absolutely crucial that you don't let there be an ending in which this character is seen to be the heroine. You know. Or I can't remember what. Can you remember, Alistair? What your
Something about gesture. I do remember it. I remember because Michael Hewitt, he was working on it actually. I must talk to him about something, but Michael was there also, and there was about nuance, the nuanced kind of gesture of what she was saying and all. Yeah, with John, but it was good. I mean, it was healthy in the end. It went, the discussion was good. Yeah. I mean, one time I remember one thing, I think it was exactly the last, where these guys come out with guns. Do you remember that, Ali, down in Cromwell Street? Were you on that one? It was like one night and somebody was saying like, who are these? And it was like a local group of armed militia, basically, that suddenly appeared, you know, they'd seen us filming, and I think they thought, you know, the idea of it was quite an attractive proposition. And they came out with, you know, weapons, but, you know, showed themselves and then moved away. But yeah, and some of the other scenes in Divis Flats also, some of those scenes actually do have soldiers in them. They're not soldiers that are actors. We were making the film. I don't know if you remember that one, Ali, with Rosina on the landing, and the soldiers that come by. I don't think we ever got release forms for those people. Anyway, yeah. So yeah, different things. Yeah, different kinds of events. I mean, it was 83. Yeah, it's just a couple of years after the hunger strike.
Pete, Ellie, but were there any similar experiences on a project like what happened here? I mean, it's really moving and engrossing to look at people contemplate archival photos of themselves. And I wonder whether it's perhaps not totally detached from some of those conversations you might have with an actor about their character. You can see in what happened here, people, I think, asking questions, you know, who was I? Why was I there? What was I doing? What was my motivation? Do these things remain constant today, or have they changed over time?
I mean, what's interesting, I mean, it was strange with that film because it came out during the pandemic, and we weren't able to really, I mean, I did send rough cuts around actually to certain individuals to look at, but we weren't able to like have a group showing or anything before the film went out. Although we did show it on our own Offside Cinema network as a sort of preview, and quite a few people from the community came in to discuss it on that. But what was interesting, I think, in a way, what that film does is it kind of is, and I think this is something that we kind of specialize a little bit in now, with several films that we've done where we've gone back to communities that we've worked with before, is that the film itself is a kind of dialogue between different people in the community who have different experiences and different points of view that they maybe have never heard, actually, you know. And people rang me up afterwards and say, or I would meet somebody out walking in the woods or whatever, and they would say they'd seen it, and they'd say, well, I never knew that, you know, and I never knew she thought that, and you know, and that was quite gratifying. And I mean, it's hardly been shown yet because of the lockdown and pandemic, and it'll be interesting to see, because it's quite subtle, but I mean, there are very particular points of view and things that happened during the strike, which still people have ambivalent feelings about. you know, tactics, what happened, how the strike ended, for example, and the character of the well, he's not a character, he's a real person, of the union man, the union leader in Easington, who put a motion to the DMA in Durham that they couldn't hold out, you know, and that was very instrumental in the ending of the strike. And some people still feel that that was a wrong decision, you know, and it's still contentious, you know, but in a way, the film doesn't come down on either side. It doesn't say, well, this guy was wrong, or this, you know, it just presents it, and you sort of judge it for yourself, I suppose. And for him, I think it was quite a hard thing to talk about, but also maybe quite like a kind of unburdening as well,
Mm-hmm.
you know, of what his role was in that, and the sadness of it, and how he felt guilty, and, you know. So I think that it's almost like that debate is within the film rather than before it went out. It's sort of encapsulated in the way that the film is constructed.
And Ellen and Pete, do you both with this film have a sense that, and I realize the answer may be different depending on the particular conversation we're talking about, but do you have a sense that the film, if you like, documents conversations that are happening in public within the community over several decades, or is there a sense that instead, or as well, the film is, and with its approach to archive, is opening up the possibility for people to have conversations which have remained largely unsaid since the time of the events that the work depicts?
I think most of the conversations are limited to people who experienced it. I mean, it's interesting what happens when you kind of go back to communities, particularly talking to young people as well. I mean, we've got an education wing now that kind of goes into schools and shows stuff. I mean, shortly after the all the mines closed, you know, people were going into schools and taking a piece of coal, and kids, not only did they know what had just happened in their communities, but they didn't know what a piece of coal was. So there is a huge kind of gap in experience. So I think the number of people who are still around, who have a real kind of personal involvement in those political times, are becoming fewer and fewer, you know, obviously. How it's viewed in the future, I think, is really down to how the people who are taking this work out. Because I mean, I don't think this will ever get on TV. It'll never be broadcast, this film. I mean, Ellie's going to maybe a bit more optimistic than I am, but we've tried, and people are not really kind of interested in this particular story. It's a very kind of particular story, I think. Sorry, go on.
Oh, well, I'm going to be quite interested to see, because we're actually going to show it. We're having another Miners' Picnic this year, which we were involved in doing the Miners' Picnic, which is in the film. And we're going to show the film at the Miners' Picnic this year. And it'll be interesting to see, because that'll be a very wide audience if people come. I mean, they may not. But the younger generation, I mean, I think, because for me, the motivation about making the film was, in a way, for the younger generation to see what their parents did and what they fought for and why. And, you know, to me, it's very moving. You know, you see these people who were, you know, in their 20s and 30s at the time, and now they're in their 60s and 70s, you know, but they're still just as kind of militant and you know, passionate about what they fought for. And I think that you know, the thing that really kills me is when in 1984 or 1985 at the end of the strike, and you have that speech, there's a speech by Billy Stubbs, who was the union leader at the time, who's dead now, and he says, yeah, the young lads will never forget, you know, they were, you know, the Tory government and the Tory press and the Tory judiciary, they will never forget what they did to our community, you know. And then 35 years later, you have Brexit, and you have people, a large number of people voting for the Tories, you know, and it seems completely unimaginable that that could happen in that time. And part of that is to do with the story not having been told, I think, you know, people not knowing their own story, really. The younger generation, not just not knowing what coal is, but knowing, you know, what their parents fought for, you know.
That scene with the protagonist at the end on a beach, I think, is really extraordinary in that regard. You know, where he points to these rocks and says, if you don't know anything about this, it's just a rock with a hole in it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you'll give me space to explain that this is actually a really integral part of your recent history, and yet it's already in danger of being lost.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk about here, maybe going back to acceptable levels? I mean, just sticking with this theme about the importance and the different ways in which you share finished work with the community. I mean, what was the approach with acceptable levels to showing and sharing the work? I mean, again, there's that scene towards the end of the film, and I really like the understated black comedy of it, where the family are watching the broadcast on television. But clearly, for the purposes of the BBC, they're now utterly surplus to requirements. I mean, they're just another 4 viewers. In what ways did you share the finished work with the community at the time, and what was the thinking behind that as an important part of the process?
Well, I mean, from where we were, we went into back into the local community, because we promised, I think what Ali's saying about, you know, us being in the community, we went into Divis and we went into the local community centres there, and we premiered it there, and the response was quite amazing, just for people to be able to see that there they were, and, you know, the actors and their families, people came along dressed up, and it was a great evening. You know, it was this great follow-up to that. And since, I mean, you'd still see the people about. I mean, I saw Paddy Higgins, you know, the other day. This Belfast, quite a small community in many respects. One of the side effects, I suppose, of the troubles in a divided community has been that people have remained. So quite a lot of the actors and actresses that were in acceptable levels are still about. And, you know, you would see them from time to time in that. So, yeah, I think that the feeling of empowerment, where people feel empowered, that they can act, that they can contribute, that they can, that their voice is heard. So it was from that, I mean, there were certain challenges that arose, I suppose. And as I say, we went down a different route. We did have a workshop in the centre of the city, and we tried to do a lot of cross-community work at that time, which was needed. So it's challenging. Again, I mean, what I say about community, I do feel that it's difficult in the facilitation of it. I mean, Pete and Ali would know much more about it than I would, but I do think that in different cultural areas, it does need a very slow-enabled hand to facilitate cultural activity, especially things like filmmaking and photography. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, Johnny. I think it's tricky. You know, it's tricky how, you know, people can become go towards the traditional means of production, if you want to look at it in that way. And maybe there's other ways, and I think Amber have been trying to push those other ways out, different ways of showing and finding out about how you process a film. Whereas some people can be, I mean, a number of the people went into acting traditionally and moved into the, you know, traditional media, some of them. Others went in the different directions. It's problematic, I think, and it does need, it needs a different, I feel, just in what I'm listening to about what Ellie's saying about the miners' strike and the impact, the cultural impact of that on those mining communities. I mean, it's unspeakable. What was done and what seems to be still affecting. I mean, you know, as a kind of cipher and a code for communities that are just disregarded. I don't know if traditional media are really have ever, or I mean, yeah, Channel 4, the workshop declaration was an attempt at trying to raise that, but I think it needs a newer approach. It needs a different more. I don't know if the current political, social, economic sort of climate that we exist in at the moment, globalization and so forth, really addresses any Indigenous or local people in a way that enables that facilitation to unfold creatively. I think it can't be done. I mean, I feel it has its aspects that clearly with Amber and that has been done, but I don't know if there's any one way. Sorry, I'm meandering a little bit on it.
I mean, do you think that, I mean, are you saying that in a way, the level of production in acceptable levels and the level, I mean, it was tiny budget, obviously, comparatively to feature films at the time, but it was still quite a, you know, it was quite a big show, wasn't it? And I think people were surprised by it when they saw it, you know, you know, it's like a proper film. They said they hadn't expected it to be such a like proper film in that film. But do you think that in a way that also was an impediment to things going forward because you couldn't replicate that? You know, I mean, that was about a certain budget and a certain crew coming in from London, and you know that wasn't possible for people to take that and run with it in terms of making new productions in that vein, obviously. And that might have almost, even though it was a great experience for them at the time, it might have been a bit like a intimidating, a sort of one-off thing that happened that was very significant, but
it can be prohibitive, I think, Ali. I mean, it's interesting that, I mean, here you have a group of committed filmmakers that are coming into a community like yourselves, and actually facilitating and enabling, bringing your expertise to that community. It's almost like what may need to be done is where there's a sympathetic kind of professionalism. I don't use that word, I mean, cautiously, but where people have competencies in those areas and they are prepared to assist and enable communities to give them a voice. And I think that's what that's the workshop declaration, I think in many ways was about, to try to open that up, to let that flower, because communities haven't got maybe the expertise or the wherewithal or even the will to say, yes, we want to make a feature film, but we don't know how. How can we engage with this? You know, how do you write it? How do you do a script? All of that, right the way through. And also on top of that, a sympathetic way of doing that, where it is sensitive to and considerate of the community that one is attempting to enable, with all of the kind of minefield that can be also. But I think it can be done. Even, I mean, if we look at the technologies that are about today, I think it can be done. Whether or not there's the wherewithal, whether or not there are people like yourself, Ali, forgive me, around that are prepared to kind of, you worked with the BBC and you saw that and you saw the contradictions physically and kind of suffered under that in a sense and worked that through. Whether or not there are people in the BBC now who would be have that courage, would have that kind of sensitivity to approach the making of a film in that way, or other places, I don't know. And you know, that might be a question. How does?
I think there's still an incredible barrier to people getting involved in spite of all the plethora of media courses that there are, you know, all over every bloody university, and you know, poly or you know, college has a media course on it, but it doesn't result in people getting into the media industry really in any significant way. And it's class. It's about class, I think. I mean, you know, you look at the BBC, I'm sure that it's exactly the same as it was.
Absolutely.
It was then in terms of the intake of people that are getting those jobs. And, you know, that's the problem. How do you break that? I mean, even if you, I mean, you know, with the representation of women in the media and Black Lives Matter and all that, you know, you can try to, and a lot of lip service is paid towards increasing the, you know, the content, the amount of, and the amount of female directors, etc. But in terms of class and people coming from working class communities, I just don't think it even touches them really. I mean,
no, I'd agree.
And I mean, if anything, it's gone backwards, I think, you know, from the position where we were at that time.
Yeah, and I think what's worse about that, I mean, is that it doesn't, there doesn't seem to be a kind of a margin of celebration of that community or a sense of that. It has, because there's nothing, there seems to be very little by way of the distribution and exhibition of that. But I just wonder if the actual means of production themselves mitigates against a different sort of, and how people can be absorbed into a kind of a hierarchy of celebrity. You know, I mean, when in the workshop, we never had personal, you know, titles, you know, director, producer, or, you know, camera or editor or anything like in that sense. So it's challenging for people who are in a particular, say, a working class community and feeling then empowered to celebrate their community. They can be absorbed into, I mean, I don't know, the Adorno Horkheim thing, the whole thing about the cultural industry. And what does that look like today? It's almost like the whole structure, as you're saying, Ali, about the BBC, it kind of, it mitigates against, because the people don't have, they're not coming from that community, and people who come from the community then change and are absorbed into the pyramidal structure of the culture. You know, it needs a broader shift in, you know, the celebration of a voice or a particularity of a culture, and that has worth. It's I think that the worth of a community, even being battered, like you're saying about the miners community in Durham, the heart that's still there, for that to be really unfold. It's like there's a cultural logjam, and it's still, unfortunately, I agree with you, like it's still 1983, that still seems to remain. How do you actually really enable a different way of approaching things, a different way of integrating and interacting in a real way that, you know, that doesn't fall into the shape of the structures, the rigidity of the structures that they are now, with their tokenisms. I mean, the tokenisms are just, it's like, anyway, but I do think it's possible. I think it is possible. It's just that the creativity isn't seen because the people who are commissioning that don't have that sensibility. Thank goodness for Amber. In that sense, at least you've been in that long enough to have that sensibility and closeness to the pulse of a community.
I mean, maybe what it is maybe what it takes is actually activists, you know, because I think, like, the two examples, we recently had a series that we did on our Offside Cinema, where we were looking at collectives now, because we'd done a series about the workshops before that, and we did a contemporary one, and two of the examples were really inspiring to me. One was a collective that were working in Rojava in Syria, you know, with the Kurdish autonomous in the autonomous region, and they were making films in basically, you know, bombed out cities, but they were also like training young people to use cameras and motivating young people to get involved in making films as a revolutionary tool, you know.
Yeah.
And then the other example was a group called they were called Unicorn Riot in Minneapolis, who did a lot of work with the Black Lives Matter protests and also protests in general. I think they they go back quite a long way, but they had been doing a lot of streaming of protest, you know, live streaming of protests at the time, you know, that they were happening, and what they were doing was, you know, they were just giving cameras out to people,
Yeah.
you know, and saying, go film it.
Yeah.
You know, and then come back, and if you've got, you know, questions about how to use the technology, or you want to learn about editing, come back and talk to us. And, you know, so that was like, it's like a really like radical approach, but I think that's what it needs, really. I don't think you can ever get a college course that is going to do that.
No, I agree. I think college, college courses are part of the problem. I mean, in relationship to it. In fact, my son, against our kind of advice, got into the film industry. I mean, he's working in like from Game of Thrones and all that stuff. But I mean, one of the things that he was saying when they're looking for people, I mean, at college, you know, somebody that comes along with a degree. Sorry, Johnny. I mean, I don't know if you teach media at college or whatever. They would say, we don't want, you know, because it's theoretical. They don't actually have the practicality of being able to handle a camera or even get into that whole apprenticeship, which I think is, personally, it's quite vital that it removes itself. Yeah, Ali, I mean, I would say certainly a lot of the education, so-called educational structures fit into the overall system, and that the system needs to change. But I don't think the system will change by itself, because it seems to have a kind of a hierarchy of self-interest there, and it's capable of absorbing a lot of innovation. It's always on the lookout for innovation, but it becomes tired, because the actual innovation, thankfully, in a way, there's a lot of great culture that's preserved because it's not understood. The people are not, they don't speak that language. I mean, speak it, but they don't live the quality of the community that they come from, you know? So yeah, that Minneapolis thing, it sounds like by way of really developing that and processing that, I think it has to have a broader kind of economic underpinning, like cooperative, friendly society, I don't know, Bitcoin, whatever, some way that money can be returned into the community, and allow the community to facilitate and to commission themselves. It's almost like a training in commissioning, and for that to be slow, the way acceptable levels, and to an extent, the framework of that and how that enabled, you know, there maybe needs to be totally different models of creative production. And you know, you've been, I mean, my goodness, you're trying it. I mean, in that sense.
I think it's a mistake to go and look at the traditional forms of distribution, like the traditional broadcasters. I think it's a complete dead loss. I don't think there's a future for them, really. Yeah. But also the difference now from years ago. I remember when VHS first came in, everybody's saying that will kind of free up creativity of everybody, you know, every person who can get his hands on it or her hands on the camera, they'll be the new filmmakers, the new directors. It never happened. I think things are very different now, because everybody's walking around with, you know, look at the technology. You've got a thing in your pocket that can do amazing stuff. It can record, it can, you know, take photographs, it can transmit these images, you know, around the world, you know, and that surely is where creativity can found itself now within those technologies.
So why do you think it isn't happening, Pete? You can ask.
Well, it is happening in places. Ellie's just described two examples of it a few minutes ago.
Yeah. No, I wonder why there isn't such an explosion. I mean, and I agree with you. I mean, I think that, you know, VHS, you know, even reel to reel before that, there was this great we felt there's a great opportunity that at last this logjam will be stopped. But it seems to me we've got a reverse where there's a tsunami of exhibition, YouTube, what have you. There's a tsunami of outlet, and there's everybody, as you say, can be walking around taking images or photographs or film, but they don't know how. It's almost like they know how to look at it, but they don't know how to read. There's an illiteracy in the context of what they're, of really that feel for their own expression, but also a way that I feel it resists being absorbed. If you look at the history of rap, or you look at, you know, how local communities have actually evolved at a musical level, and how that can be very quickly appropriated, that the system itself really needs, it's a different, maybe as Ellie was maybe asking, maybe a different way of showing, or a different way of integrating with the community that it resists. People are, it's distributed or shown in that community, and that's a vital part of it. That is an integral part. You start from the thing being shown in community, and it has to have that ingredient. Almost as much as one can, it will at some point maybe run into challenges, obviously, but you know, they're important points. But maybe in that sense that it resists the absorption into these class structures and that Ali was referring to. I don't know how, I mean, it's almost like a new type of filmmaking that would be a creative part of that community, and could only be kind of like initially understood with a margin of creativity. And I don't know if I make myself clear on it, but I do feel that there's, did you ever see a film called The Fast Runner?
Oh, they've been showing it on this festival, I think.
Yeah.
It's one of the films, isn't it, Johnny?
I'm not sure, that one may have passed me by this time.
It is, folks. It's showing as part of our program, and we have the director. I believe the film was made collectively by the Isuma Collective in the Canadian Arctic.
Yeah,
kind of Inuit led. But the director Zacharias Canuck is talking with us on Friday.
Fantastic! What a great one, Jimmy. You're doing a great job there. I think that, yeah, I mean, that there is, I think, a great example of like Inuit and people in a local community really making an epic. I mean, it's Shakespearean and it's Vista, and it is such a powerful narrative, and deceptively simple. And to have that remaining, it would have been for that to be distributed almost, or the kind of the commercial, the economic success of it, if there was that, to be returned into the community in a manner of speaking. I think maybe that's it, that there has to be in some way a kind of like the workshop declaration, a declaration that, you know, profit, I mean, it's complicated, you know, that are returned into a local. One of the things that there's a kind of small nascent, just to digress a little bit, cooperative groupings going on here at the moment, and we're trying to get local legislation changed that will allow credit unions to support local creative endeavors. Okay, and what's good about credit unions is it's a way of economically people, you know, having direct control from their community as much as they can without being involved with arts councils that require all sorts of things. So ways of returning, I'm just thinking about models of cooperation that enable the people to really, as best as they can, have a sort of a power, a sense of their own power, a sense of their own purpose, and a sense, there's an incredible amount of low self-esteem, I think, right across Europe, globally, I think, and I think the media have a large kind of part to play in developing that. Traditional medias, I do think it needs to change. But anyway, sorry, I'm just digressing.
Yeah, the route to kind of economic, economic funding is so complicated. I mean, it's how anybody could negotiate those kind of nightmares of fundraising to make something, even at the smallest kind of economic level, it's kind of beyond most people.
Absolutely, Pete. I was talking to somebody the other day from the Arts Council of Northern Ireland here, and I mean, the documents that you have to fill in and the kind of the amount of validating, you know, as it cross communities. And we were saying it would be great if somebody just came along and said to a group, look, here's 10 grand or here's 20 grand, just take it, it's okay, and go away. And you have it a certain amount of money, and you just give it to a number of groups. And okay, some of the groups mightn't work, it might go astray, what have you, but at least to be able to just say to people, look, here you are, here's the power. And I think something like that coming along could be quite a shock, because, you know, people work at a level of just enjoyment. The sheer, like the people that Ali's talking about in Minneapolis, just here's the camera, go on out and bring it back. And if you're interested, we can follow it through. That's practical, it's direct, it's active, it's actually happening. And there's no strings. You're just saying, let's give this a go. I think a lot of younger people in particular feel beat down by the kind of the tsunami of, I can't do this, and they're invisible. There's an invisibility of so much media information that it's very difficult to see your way through that or feel that you could really do something.
I think it's really interesting what you're saying about, you know, collaboration and collectivism being maybe the key to it, because and the fact that these sort of things are happening, you know, on the edgelands, in the areas which have the least amount of resources and money, are the places where these kind of initiatives are actually happening, because they have to get together in order to do anything at all. And also they're you know, there's no way that their point of view is going to be put across any other way unless they do it themselves. And so there's a kind of motivation to do that, to get together. And I mean, I know Unicorn Riot just raise all their money through crowdfunding, and, you know, those kind of initiatives, which at least you can control that, and you then have control of what the goals are, that you're not having to step over all these artificial kind of hurdles that are invented by the Arts Council or whatever. You know, you can just go ahead and do it. And I mean, in a way, I mean, that was what the workshop declaration was. I mean, it was a moment in time when we seized control and got that money without strings. For just a period of 10 years, and then it was gone, you know. And it never really happened again like that. But it could, as you say, in a different way, in different forms, I think.
I think you can't keep culture down. You can't. I mean, it's bound to, you know. It's just
anyway, we should
sorry, John.
Sorry, we've run off on some kind of...
No, it's smashing. We're covering so much ground now, and fingers crossed this one follows on from where we've just been. And I wanted to ask you whether it's in relation to the two specific films that we're talking about tonight, or your wider respective bodies of work more generally, if you'd be willing to say something about your aesthetic preferences and allegiances. Because one thing that's been coming through quite strongly for me in the discussion over the last 5-10 minutes is talking about a need for system change in terms of access to the means of production, and talking about a need for system change in terms of access to the means of circulation or exhibition. And when I think back to some of the other pioneering workshop practitioners, it seems to me that they also concluded that there was a need for system change in terms of aesthetics and expression. And a lot of the work that they were producing shared very little, if anything, with mainstream televisual and cinematic aesthetic and narrative form. Whereas when I think about works like Acceptable Levels or What Happened Here, one of the things that I think is really thought-provoking and exciting about them is that they somehow managed to engage their audience in very sophisticated and self-aware discussions about the politics and practice of representation, but they also managed to use aspects of mainstream cinematic and televisual form that create works that are totally accessible to everyone. You don't need to have a PhD. You don't need to know how to operate a film camera. I mean, it's genuinely popular moving image culture. Anyone can sit down and watch it. And was that idea of something that was simultaneously aesthetically accessible but also politically radical a balance that was important to you when you were making these films, or indeed when you've been making other projects since?
Who wants to answer that?
Okay. I mean, personally, I mean, I lacked any kind of real film vocabulary as regards editing, for example. Say you could teach editing, there's about 5 or different kinds of edit, or sound production, or the importance of sound in relationship to film, or the importance of music. Okay. Later on, what we did for a short time in the workshop was we looked at experimental filmmaking in a very detailed manner. Johnny did look at ways that vocabulary, that grammar, if you want, how it could be not necessarily contested, but how it can be met. How do you, is it possible to teach someone reasonably quickly film vocabulary? I don't think it is. I think you need to do it over a period of time. Because people are used to that menu. They have a particularity, even though they may not be aware of it, that grammar needs to be developed. And there's ways that ways that we tried to do it was through photography and animation, like kinestasis, like moving images. If you're thinking of something like, I don't know, Ligeti, like Chris Marker's text, in that sense of looking at different ways that you could effectively and economically try to engage people in a way. Remember the film, Ellie, we talked about the Mexican film about the guy, and he made that as a feature film made of just still photographs. I don't know, a couple of years back I sent you some, I can't remember the name of it, but basically different ways that an aesthetic that would engage with the scent, that would actually not just be, what would you say? It's a bit like the difference between people taking images. If you look at, I mean, the many millions of images that are uploaded on something like Instagram every day, okay, that people would actually, you know, they would take birthdays, they would take certain events, and they wouldn't necessarily be aware of the aesthetic of the photograph, Johnny, in that sense, that it requires a little bit of maybe investigation into what is the meaning in what they're doing, not theoretically, but actually doing it. And that's tricky. I think it's tricky where new innovation comes. If that answers your kind of, or at least moves towards that sort of arena where you're asking about like aesthetics or sensitivity of that. It is.
Thank you, Alistair. That does. And Pete, Ellen, anything you would want to contribute here as well?
Well, it's interesting that Alistair's talking about Chris Marker and Ligeti. I mean, it's been an area that we have been working in Amber for a long time. I mean, we're working on a film right now, just made up of still photographs, which is a fantastic way of working. And we've got a huge archive on which to, which to draw on. Mm-hmm. And, I think it kind of, gives a new lease of life as well to kind of the kind of well of material that we have accumulated over the years. But it's a very powerful way of expressing ideas, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, we've done it with What Happened Here. I mean, there's an element of that in that film as well. I mean, it does kind of draw on all the kind of powerful images that Keith Patterson took at the time, who wasn't part of Amber, by the way. We just happened to have a collection of his work, and he kind of kindly offered to let us use the material that he has as well, which is kind of a great opportunity. But taking those images and presenting them in a different way is, it's just another way of telling the story, kind of often a kind of very moving way, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
I suppose what I would say on this is that like Amber's work and Acceptable Levels as well are not kind of in any obvious way experimental, because I think we've always been really concerned about that our audience, like the audience is first and foremost the people from those communities, and secondly, a working class audience, like it was really important to us that that the films were accessible. That, like you say, you didn't have to have a PhD in order to understand. But where the radical bit comes in, or the experimental bit comes in, is in the way the point of view is, so that it's kind of it's a kind of surreptitious way of changing what is being said, and one of those techniques is by removing any kind of authoritative or objective voice over in any of the films that we make, but also just in terms of like who are the people that are center frame, you know. That's the difference. I mean, they don't necessarily look that different, but they are different, if you know what I mean, because of the content.
I think that I can only speak personally, but for me, it's the difference between something that is radical, not because it tears something down, but because it manages to turn something inside out or turn something against itself and create something that looks conventional, but is in fact anything but.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to say. Yeah, thank you.
I'm aware of time here and that we have to finish at 8:30. And if it's okay, I'm going to make sure we do have time for this. I'm going to pose what Jamie and I have been calling a $64,000 question, and we're asking it of all our guests this week. And goes something like this. What's the resonance for all of you of something we might call a folk cinema or a people cinema, or label it or categorize it slightly differently if you prefer? And do you consider aspects of your own work to be part of that phenomenon, or to be describable in that way, whether in terms of its form, its intent, its effect, or all of those things? Do you see yourself, do you see what you're making as an example of contemporary folk or people's culture?
I think in the sense that what we hope we're doing is creating something that everybody understands, that they do know the stories, and they, you know, and there's nothing that they that, you know, people haven't, is beyond that, that's beyond their experience. Would you say that, Ellie, about our work? I think to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, I feel very honoured to be in this folk film gathering, and we have been in every single one that's happened, I think, so far. And I really like the concept that Jamie and his collective came up with. But I often have to explain it to people when I talk to them about it, that because folk has such a connotation, a different connotation, I think, partly because of music, but I know that's deliberate. But yes, I absolutely think that's what we're trying to do. But I think it's you know, to be a cinema of the people and a cinema of the of coming out of the experience of the people that we're making the films about, and that's what how I would define the folk. You know, its connection with folk culture is that it comes out of that community or that locality or that experience, you know, directly. But of course, the big question, and I think, I mean, I'm coming to the end, probably towards the end of my filmmaking life, and I feel like that maybe things are moving on now in a different direction, and I feel quite happy to step back, because I think that in a way it's not enough now to go into a community. Even though I live in Easington and I've lived here for 20 years, I don't consider myself to be from this community, and I think that actually it's time now that the cameras were given to the people themselves. I mean, I'm not quite sure how that's going to happen, but I kind of feel that I actually feel that my own position is a bit untenable in whatever's going to happen next. Like I do feel like I'm an interloper in a way, and I've spent my life trying to be like an intermediary and to represent people's voices that haven't been heard. But I think now it's time to hand over the camera and the voice and the platform.
Alistair, on that bombshell.
Okay, I mean, we're in two kitchens. I think it looks like Pete's in a kitchen and I'm in a kitchen.
Indeed.
So the notion of folk, the idea of like folk music, when people play together, the kind of individual can go. And in the early days of Russian filmmaking, as far as I know, Soviet filmmaking, what they would do is they would break a plate. And if at the end of the filmmaking, because it's, as we know, it's generally a collaborative process, if the plate could be put back together as best as possible, it would be, from a kind of like animistic thing, it would be a successful film. But so the idea of actually a group of people coming together, like the way a group of musicians come together possibly to play, especially informally, which can be a great delight. I know Ellie plays music informally also beautifully, you know, that the kind of informality and the passion of a group of people coming together, a group of folk, and to coagulate around that in a creative process, be it music or be it filmmaking, which is a difficult thing, I think is the essence, or indeed, be it going to the cinema, the notion of cinema going, as probably we would probably traditionally know, and the ritual around all of that, which could be getting lost, not ritual in that sense, but so folk, it's great, the notion of a folk cinema. It's great that the idea, maybe traveling around, the idea, I remember being in the west of Ireland, I had this traveling, this great big old Larry, actually a furniture van, and they were showing films in that. So the notionality of like the folk people coming together, be it to watch something, to make something, to celebrate something, especially that it's local, I think is the genesis, the origination of that sense of folk. It's a great title, folk cinema. It's brilliant. Keep it going. And so, and Amber, you know, folk cinema. There you go. And I don't like to hear Ellie retiring at this point, because her energy and what she tries to do was a driving force, certainly on acceptable levels. She was the thing that drove, from the point of view of her own experience and going it through and coming into community and supporting that. Anyway, that's folk cinema. Great.
And then thank you. Then the last wee bit of the question. I think some of it you've already been touching on, so it may be just a repetition or reiteration. Are there particular films, filmmakers, film collectives, film movements out there who today really inspire you in terms of this idea of what a folk cinema is or could be? Whose voices should be?
I'd like to just talk a little bit about this Rojava film commune, which I mentioned before, because I was just so inspired by their work. And you know, it's interesting, Alistair, that you talk about, you know, the lorry going around the villages with a screen, because that's exactly what they're doing. You know, they're going around with and putting up a sheet in the middle of the village square in all these little villages in the Kurdish region, and you know, they see film. I mean, for me, what was so inspiring about it was that it was so optimistic as well, because you know, they definitely see film as a revolutionary tool, and they see it as a way of describing how the future could be, you know, and that's what they see their role as, you know, within the community, is to articulate how things could change for the better, you know, and I just thought that was really amazing. And I'm just so, I mean, I'm just so impressed that they could do all this work, you know, when you see the films they make, and they're like just filming in these kind of completely bombed out cities, you know, and they have nothing, you know, and yet they're doing work that is has more importance and relevance than than all the you know, what we can produce from the West, you know, with all our money and all our resources, you know.
Thank you. Pete, Alistair, any?
Yeah, so there's a cinema, they have a cultural night in Belfast. There was a beanbag cinema down in the centre of the town, and they showed somebody had taken the kind of soundtrack of the first Star Wars, and they had celebrated this by every different people would do different scenes, like with, you know, little animations. So the soundtrack was used as a guide track, but each section, it involved hundreds of people acting it out in their garage, like doing the different scene out of it. And it was incredibly collaborative, and it was, you know, absolute a delight, just in that sort of uniqueness of just not just celebratory. And I was wondering what Ellie's saying about people taking around, you know, cinema again. Perhaps a clue might lie in a folk cinema that actually looks at the showing as an integral part of it, you know, that it becomes part of actually projection. It's like people going back to LPs as vintage, that the idea of going into a community and having that as a kind of an ongoing event might be worthwhile looking at, you know, because it comes back to the whole idea of theatre and the origins of cinema, and the communal aspect to it, something that can be very much lost where we're dealing with an internet culture, you know, a fate worse than Zoom, impending Zoom that Jamie was referring to earlier, that, you know, actually makes it into an event, you know, for a community, and that whole interaction can be part of showing the film.
I think that's right. I think the idea of coming together is the thing that really I find inspiring. It's what's happening with beer, isn't it? The odd thing is, you know, we've got pubs opening up in old shops. We've got one down the road here. It's amazing, you know. There's no reason why they couldn't be showing films as well, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. A film night. There's an eco village in South Tipperary, and that's what they do. They have like a film night every like 3 weeks, and it's just upstairs in the pub, and they play music after, you know, and it's just a projector with video, but it's the whole social interaction. There's kids running about enjoying them. There's all of that, and you know, maybe that could be worth looking at and breaking it out of the, you know, BFI regional cinemas or what have you. You know, that can be a bit stuffy and removed, you know, and a bit, you know, not kind of like open and loose and freer, that sense of folk, Johnny, you know, that sense of,
it's like the stories you hear about, you know, in music gatherings in the kind of in the 18th century, when people would, you know, wander about and kind of shout out for play that one again, play that one again. Leopold.
Yeah. And I mean, if the films were good, people could actually engage. What sort of films would you like then, in that sense? If people like a particular film, like booing at the film or shouting at it or saying, you know, the director's here, the camera person's here, what have you, to really kind of open that up, you know?
Well, in other circumstances, I'm painfully aware we could not just keep talking about this, but start doing this directly in the pub. Yes. And I'm hoping before too long, maybe next year, if you'll all come back, we'll be able to do that. But in the meantime, I'm afraid we've reached the end of our time. So I just want to say, Alistair, Ellie, Pete, thanks very much for sharing your work with us as part of this year's gathering, and double thanks for your equal generosity in coming and speaking to us about it tonight. It's been great to have you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny, for great, you know, moderating, and Jamie as well. And Ali and Pete, it's great, and Louisa and Karen.
It's great.
Has it been technically okay? I've got a lot of stuttery images at my end. Is it my internet or anybody else has got the same problem?
No, there's a wee bit of,
yeah. The sound's been grand. I think there's a couple of times when things have stuttered.
Yeah.
It's that weird thing on Zoom. The scariest, it's like an episode of Tales of the Unexpected or something. When your own camera stutters and you're kind of looking at a picture of yourself that hasn't moved for about 20 minutes.
Can everybody else see?
Right.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Okay,
Bye.
all the best. Nice seeing you. Take care. Take care, Ali.
Bye-bye.
Take care, Pete. Lovely seeing you.
Bye-bye.
All the
Yeah.
Nice
best.
to see you, yeah.
I know.
I'll come and see. We're coming to see you, Ellie, shortly.
Good.